All right, we just had the clapper sound, so we are in sync. I think you see me on one side, and soon, well, you're seeing James on the other side right now, if we do this right. But you know me, David Eckerman. I am the boss. But I'm naive. I have an opinion about free will, and I am a determinist. And those things combine for me, in my naive view, as saying, really, there is no free will. What happens in the world in one moment will determine what happens in the world in the next moment. Now, I don't think there's an overall plan that determines the whole path of things that are going to happen. There are accidents aplenty. There are convergences. So if I'm walking down the street and a brick falls off a building and hits me, my life will be changed. But in a particular way, with a particular sequence to follow. So that's an easy thing for me to believe in. It's an easy thing for me to believe in as a scientist, that the world is orderly and it is not changeable at whim, my whim, or even a God's whim. I think the world is unfolding as it will unfold. But we have an opportunity to have a philosopher react to that and educate us and tell us more about how it might be, because my view is remarkably naive. Is that right, Jay?
No, it's not right. Your view is not remarkably naive. You have a very sophisticated view, and it's a view that would generally be called hard determinism. I'm a determinist too.
Oh.
A lot of philosophers are determinists, but there are a lot of philosophers who are not determinists, who don't believe that this picture of the universe as being a succession of events, each of which is caused by the totality of the previous events. So there's a sense in which, given certain circumstances at any one moment, the rest is inevitable, or seems to be. That notion of determinism, which I accept as a general view of the way reality operates, as a general metaphysical view in that sense, that's controversial, just like just about everything in philosophy. So there are philosophers who are determinists, and there are philosophers who are opposed to determinism, usually not because of free will, often because of quantum mechanics in physics. But among the philosophers who are determinists, you get hard determinists and soft determinists. And hard determinists are determinists who are also convinced that determinism and free will are incompatible. And
I'm going to turn off my phone.
So among determinists, there are hard determinists, and to be a hard determinist is to hold two positions. One is determinism as a general metaphysical position, and second, the position that determinism is incompatible with free will. That there's no way you can have free will in a deterministic universe.
Okay, that would represent my view.
Yeah. And then the soft determinist is also a determinist. The soft determinist holds two views. The first is determinism as a general metaphysical view. But secondly, that in fact free will, properly understood, turns out to be compatible with determinism. That you can have this deterministic universe, and I agree with you about that, about there being no ultimate purpose, but that there's still something that deserves to be called free will that people might have, even if the universe is deterministic.
That's the one I think my students want to know about.
Compatibilism. Compatibilism is often a neglected topic when free will and determinism are discussed. There's this very strong and very credible sense that you articulated just a moment ago, that if the universe is deterministic, if it is just unfolding as this series of causes and effects, then there's no way we can have free will. But what exactly is free will? Compatibilism says that actually that sense that these two things are inconsistent or incompatible with each other, that it's this hard choice between free will or determinism. You can't have both. One excludes the other. That this is an illusion. That this sense of the philosophical question is mistaken. And that in fact, when you understand free will better, you can see how there's no conflict after all.
So help me understand free will in this way.
Okay. I think the best way maybe to introduce compatibilism is to talk about a friend of mine who is a philosopher. And her first name is Anna, and her last name is Lytical. So Anna Lytical is a compatibilist. And she has a particular theory or a particular analysis of the concept of free will. She
might be named after her.
It might not be, but it might be called something like the no coercion theory or something. So
okay.
There's this particular theory that my friend Anna has. And so let's talk about that first. So what Anna says is that we first need to think about what we're talking about. You know, we talk about free will, but what do we mean by that? And she says, let's think about an example or two. The example of being mugged or being set upon by a highwayman in olden times as you're making your way through the forest.
Yes.
And this person comes along and says, your money or your life. Okay, so you have a choice situation in which your options are these. Either give your money and maybe live, or be killed and then the robber takes your money anyway. Right?
Not a good choice.
And we say in that kind of situation, you don't have a choice. You know, we say that because we don't have a good choice in that situation. But in that circumstance, would you say that you're acting freely? Would you say that you're acting of your own free will?
No. I would say that what I'm about to do is based on my whole history.
It's based on your whole history, and it's a result of a situation in which you are being coerced, in which you're being threatened.
Absolutely.
Okay? So here's Anna's reasoning. She says, well, since in a situation like this, where someone is being coerced by a threat, what they do is clearly not of their own free will. Maybe free will is simply the absence of coercion by threat. So in other words, Anna can say that she can be a soft determinist. She can be a determinist too. And she can have this understanding of the universe as this unfolding of events that in themselves were perhaps destined. She can be a determinist just like you and me. But she can be a soft determinist rather than a hard determinist, in that she can say there's still this thing called free will. People's behavior, she would agree, is caused by environment and heredity, and by the whole history of reinforcement and so forth. Sure, but there are different ways, right, that people's behaviors can be caused. There are the ways that involve coercion by threat, and then there are all the others. So her theory, her analysis of free will is that whenever you do not have this kind of situation where you're coerced by a threat, then you're free. So you have free will, your behavior is still determined, but as long as it's been determined by things other than coercion by threat, you're free and you have free will.
Maybe that links with this point that I firmly believe in. I will fight to get to a position where I have choices that I would love to savor and understand and finally do the thing I'm
where you have good
supposed
options available to you in your choice situation.
And even pigeons will choose a situation where they have choices rather than being imposed, having a situation imposed on them, even when that imposed situation represents their prior list of choices. So it represents their preferences, but still they will choose an option where they have the choices rather than the choices predetermined according to their prior preferences.
So even pigeons have a result, have a desire for free will.
Well, I think that I'll go with that.
I used to tend to this guy's pigeons long ago, and I didn't know you were getting them that smart. Wow.
My respect for the pigeon has only grown across my lifespan, yes.
Well, right, so I speak about choice situations in which you have a number of options available to you. So you're saying that sometimes you're in a choice situation and you select an option which will lead to results expanding or improving the options available to you in a future choice situation.
I will believe that that would be the choice I would make.
Okay, so that seems like a rational choice and one that reflects a concern for the position that you're going to be in the future. You want to improve the options available to you in the future by making, and the choices that you make now may not be the choice, or the options that you choose may not be the ones that you're most inclined to choose, or that you would find to be most desirable or fun. You may do some hard work instead, but the reason is that you're improving the options that will be available to you later.
Well, and actually you've described very well the behavioral position on self-control, where since you are not the same person all the time, you may at one moment make a choice to enter a world that has fewer choices later, when you have a history that those choices that will be presented later included temptation, that from this point you would like to eliminate from your choices. And so you can help yourself with self-control by making commitments to do the right thing when the temptation arises. For instance, by not having the temptation arise, by going home the other way, or by avoiding a conversation, or...
Take this bag of chips away from me.
Yes. And classic, get thee behind me, Satan. It's right there in the Bible as a behavioral suggestion.
Well, and all that sounds like good advice, and you've hit on the concept of self-control, which I think is very important here, and is one I want to loop back around to, if I may.
Well, you certainly may, and I remember now that you have a special attachment to the word control.
Well, I will talk about the control theory of freedom. But just for the moment, if I may, let's get back to Anna.
Okay.
Because actually I haven't even explained compatibilism yet.
Oh.
But analytical and her particular theory is a good way to introduce it. So let's think back to that. She has this idea that freedom is simply when your behavior is caused by factors other than coercion by threat. Right? Okay. So that's her theory. That's her analysis of the concept of free will. And she says, isn't that compatible with determinism? Seems that it is, right?
It is.
We're just dividing into two categories the different kinds of causes. We're not saying that you have this godlike ability to make a decision that was not caused, right? That seems to be the hardcore, classic or traditional concept of free will, right? So Anna is saying that's actually a mistaken way of thinking about free will. And instead, free will is just this absence of coercion by threat. Okay, so here's her particular theory, and we can see it as an example of a theory that's compatible with determinism.
All right.
Now, in fact, if you think about it, just for a little bit, you can see that Anna's theory is not a very good one. Her analysis is a poor one. It collapses almost immediately.
Anna.
Yeah, I know, but it's still a good start. Because even though she's right that when you're in a situation in which you're coerced by someone threatening you with harm, that you're not free, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you're not in that kind of situation, you are free. And that doesn't follow logically. Okay. And there are certain other circumstances, for example, acting on the basis of an addiction or some other compulsion, or doing something because of mind control by some other agent. And we can imagine situations where this is done by hypnosis or by some microchip planted in your brain or something. And
I've seen that in the movies.
Yeah, we've all seen it in movies and read it in books and so forth. And even if they're not real situations, we can imagine these situations consistently, and we can say quite reasonably, using this as an example in philosophical reflection, that, well, here's a case where we would say the person does not have free will, right? The person is under the control of Dr. X and is doing everything Dr. X commands through the internet. And we'd say, well, in that case, the person certainly isn't free. And then we've got at least really difficult questions that arise about compulsion, right? So in those cases, the person isn't under some sort of threat, right? And yet, we would say that the person is still not free. Right?
I would.
Yeah. So apparently Anna, although she's off to a good start, hasn't identified all of the kinds of situations where we would say somebody is not acting of their own free will. And her theory just can't be right, because her theory is that whenever you're acting for reasons other than coercion by threat, then your behavior is free. Well, but when you're subject to mind control,
We have to expand the list.
we have to expand the list, but more than that, I'm making a secondary point besides expanding the list, and that her theory must be wrong, right? Because her theory says that if your behavior is not caused by coercion by threat, then it is free. But the mind control situation, that's a situation where your behavior is caused by something other than coercion by threat, but you're not free. So her theory just gives the wrong result, you see, in some cases.
The theory of my friends are constantly changing to
Mhm.
include other situations. I think
Indeed.
this is what theoreticians do.
Exactly, exactly. And philosophers do the same thing. So the thing that Anna has done is to present a particular theory, the no coercion by threat theory, right? And we can see how that analysis of the concept of free will is compatible with determinism. So it serves as a good example to explain compatibilism itself. You
All
see, compatibilism itself is just the view that free will and determinism are actually compatible, and more fully, it's the view oftentimes that there's some understanding out there. There's some analysis that we ought to be able to make so that we understand what free will really is. It turns out it's not this godlike ability to initiate action that is uncaused. Instead, it's something else. Well, what is it? Anna tried to identify it. She did so incorrectly, but then let's just try to improve our theory, add to the list, if that's the way to go. And the point is that now you sort of reconceive the whole question of free will and determinism. The question of free will and determinism is not how do you make this impossible choice between the two of them. The question of determinism is now actually what is free will? What is the correct analysis of free will? What do we really mean when we say free will? And if we get that right, we may find that it's compatible with determinism and that it really does exist, even if this is a deterministic universe. So compatibilism is really just, as it's often put in practice by philosophers, is often connected with the view that there's some analysis of free will out there that we need to find.
All right.
But some philosophers, myself included, think that this whole conception of philosophy, this whole analytic conception of philosophy, is flawed. And we want to take a different approach. And I won't go into that in much detail. I'll just say that it's called constructionism, because the notion is that the philosopher is like a concept smith, crafting, engineering, designing, and building new concepts instead of trying to analyze existing concepts in ordinary language. So instead of trying to figure out what free will is, because I don't think there's really an answer to that, and I think ultimately there's no answer to the question of compatibilism, whether free will and determinism are compatible. It all depends on what you mean by free will.
We could keep expanding the list, but there'd always be more.
Maybe so, maybe so. And the attempts that people make in philosophy to come up with a theory of free will that is compatible with determinism and handles all the cases and illustrations we can think of correctly so that it matches our intuitive responses. There's always a comeback. There's always a way that somebody else can come along and say, but what about this? This is something where free will seems to be important. At the very beginning you said that it doesn't seem important, but there is this traditional view that it's a tremendously important thing whether we have free will. It determines
the basis for our
example,
law.
and whether we're morally responsible for some things that we do. So anyway,
intention.
so instead of trying to find out what free will really is, and find out whether it really does conflict with determinism or not, the constructionist approach I take is exemplified by the control theory of freedom. Okay, so let me just get into that and get your response.
All right.
So the control theory of freedom is basically the view that all of this talk about freedom and free will is really about control, and the lack of control, and the availability of control in some situations. So let me define, construct a series of concepts. First of all, I'll talk about control, and then exclusive control, and then self-control, and then autonomous control.
All right.
Okay. So first of all, what's control? Nothing mysterious about control. Control fits into a naturalistic picture of the universe. Human beings are animals, and we're all part of nature. Control is simply a relationship between a person and a thing, where the thing can be in more than one state. And the person has to have enough cognitive sophistication so that it can will something, which is like wanting it, but it's more like deciding to make it happen. So if I have control over this thing that can be in these various states, then if I will that it be in a certain state, it will, or is very likely to be in that state.
I can turn the knob.
Exactly. So you think of a light switch, it has two different states, up and down. If I'm in control of it, I can think, I'm going to flip that light switch up. So I will that that happens. There's nothing magical here. That moves my arm. And things happen in the natural physical world. I flip the switch up. And so by willing that X, I'm causing it to be the case that X. That's control.
A history can develop that.
Yes. Right. Well, animals, even infants have some control over some things, at least when they reach the point that you can say that they're willing something to be the case.
I hardly ever say that. I do understand what you're saying.
So it's really like the idea of control from cybernetics. It's a naturalistic concept, nothing mystical about it, nothing that I think is at all incompatible with the philosophical foundations of behaviorism. It's certainly compatible with determinism, that a person could have control. It's just a cause and effect relationship that holds. Okay? Exclusive control is where I am the person who has control over this thing, and I'm the only person or the only agent that has control over this thing. Okay? So that's exclusive control. Self-control is where the thing is me. And it's like what you were talking about. It's especially important to think of this in terms of two different points in time.
So is this self-control? I'm scratching my nose. I'm the only one that has that nose, and I'm the only one that has that finger.
I'm not sure that's self-control, but I'm not sure it isn't. The notion I have for self-control is that, well, control is where if I will that something happens with this thing, then it does happen with this thing.
As you might guess, I'm a little soft on this will thing.
Okay, well, let's get back to that, because I am too. So, self-control is best understood. I have trouble with the nose scratching thing because it would be better if we talked about deciding now to scratch your nose later.
Right.
The temporal gap is important in self-control. And it's what you were talking about before, where you make a choice now that will improve your options in your choice situation later. Because in a sense, you could be a different person then.
Yes.
So self-control is where, for example, I will that I will do the laundry at 8 o'clock in the morning. At 8 o'clock in the morning, that is, I make the decision that I will do the laundry at noon. Okay? And then noon rolls around and I don't really want to do laundry, but I willed that I would do the laundry, and then it turns out I do. Well, it turns out that that's just an example of control. I, at 8 o'clock in the morning, have control over what happens with me at noon. That's self-control. And then finally there's the concept of autonomous control.
The fourth.
And this is how I define autonomous control. A person has autonomous control over a thing if, first of all, they have control over the thing, and second of all, they have exclusive control of their own will. with respect to that thing.
Mm.
So if I have autonomous control over the light switch, or over the car that I'm driving, or the life that I'm living, or whatever, if I have autonomous control over it, I have control over it, there's efficacy available to me. I can do things. And my will and the decisions that I make about what I'm going to do is also under my control. I have self-control, and I have exclusive self-control.
So
There's no other agent controlling me, as in the mind control examples or the hypnosis examples.
So will is among those things that I can turn on and turn off.
There could be 100 different states in this thing, right?
Yeah.
But yes, the will itself is something that I can
How
control.
would I know what I did?
Well, let's get back to that, but let me sort of wrap it up.
Okay.
The whole idea of autonomous control is that I have control over the thing, and I also have exclusive control of my own will.
All right.
And I think when you test that against cases, actually coercion turns out to be a little tricky, but when you look at compulsion cases and mind control cases, it fits. And here's the most important thing. This idea that instead of talking about free will, we could replace the concept with a new constructed concept of autonomous control. Right? We could say moral responsibility, it isn't about this free will thing, it's about autonomous control. Did the person have autonomous control when they committed that criminal act? That could be our question instead. That is completely compatible with determinism. It's a compatibilist view. It's a more sophisticated one than the one we started with, but the point is that you can develop these ways of thinking about free will or successor concepts for free will if you just want to give free will up entirely, which is okay. And it's entirely compatible with a determinist view. Now, the Achilles heel of the view might be the concept of will. So tell me again your concern there.
Well, will is W-I-L-L, it's a word in the English language. It often is brought in when I think you don't see the source of control. It doesn't mean to me that there is no source of control. It lies in your past, it lies in your history of reinforcement. It lies in what we often call, say, the superego ideal. I mean, I'll even go with Mr. Freud that I wish other people had a stronger superego ideal, which means that they have a habit of doing things that support a whole bunch of people, including themselves, but sometimes at their own sacrifice for the good of the whole. But I don't find a will, I only find things done. So I don't know that I have a place in my naive view for something I cannot even potentially see except through behavior.
Well, I actually intend that the concept of will, as I'm using it here, is a pretty ordinary sort of thing, kind of a daily occurrence. I gave the example of deciding in the morning to do the laundry in the afternoon. That's the kind of thing that we do all the time.
We do.
Right? And so I'm describing it in the ordinary...
do a lot of laundry.
But I'm describing it in the terms that we ordinarily use. It's a little bit uncommon in present-day English to use the word will as a verb, just as the verb of the sentence. We use it often as a helping verb, isn't that right? It's a helping verb. But I'm saying things like, I will that the laundry is done. I'm using the word will there as a verb. I'm willing that a certain state of affairs come into existence in the world.
So an action rather than just a conditional upon the future event.
Well, it is an action perhaps in cognitive or neurological terms, but not in terms of behavior that could be observed by a third party, which is why the behaviorist has trouble with it.
I don't have trouble thinking that there are private events, that we all have a perspective, what we can see and what we can't see.
And there really are a whole bunch of neurons and connections up here.
And I have some sense of the state of my neurons, and I think you don't. as clearly anyway. You have hints about the state of my neurons, but I think I have a better hint.
You do know a lot more about your neurons than I ever will.
But it's not that it's a very coherent view of my neurons, it's just a reaction to a mysterious world of my neurons, that I have some information you don't.
When I'm talking about willing that something be the case, I'm talking about something that is happening among those neurons.
Yeah.
I'm talking about a neurological event of some kind. It might be functionally characterized rather than physically characterized. But there's some neuron firing or some collection of neurons firing and that constitutes my willing that X. And when there are cause and effect relationships in the world in which my doing that in my brain tends to cause X itself to actually occur, that's control. So I don't think that there's anything mysterious about the will here. I don't think that there's anything that's incompatible with the metaphysical views behind behaviorism.
Just to put a little more concreteness, not risking really being concrete, but self-talk. I can counsel myself that I should be doing this, I should be doing that, I should plan on this, I should plan on that, I should make a list of this and make a list of that. I can even make a list in my self-talk. And I think those actions of self-talk can influence my future behavior. And I think that that is in the category then that would almost be like your will. I'd also be willing to say, hey,
hard to avoid, isn't it?
Well, I would be willing to say that self-talk can be unconscious. And I think then we are already all the way there.
Well, now, if you're willing to talk about anything being unconscious, that's already a big issue.
Well, my neurons are largely unconscious, because I'm sure I have a lot of neurons. I have no...
Yeah, but you're talking about talk being unconscious, not neurons.
Well, influence being unconscious. I would take it away from talk if it's not words, I guess, but I would certainly go with neuronal influences being unconscious. In fact, I share with Freud, I think most of the interesting things are unconscious.
Okay.
I think our talk is only a thin layer of stuff on top of what is really happening.
Sure. And by the way, there's a neuroscientist named Lebet who did some research actually decades ago in which he had, I think, people in functional MRIs while they were making decisions about whether to choose A or B, just arbitrary decisions in an experiment. And what he found was that there are things that are going on in the brain that are not known to the individual, and that these neurological events correlate very well with choosing A or with choosing B, but they happen before the person reports having made a decision. Now, some scientists have said, you philosophers, you need to stop wasting your time on this stupid free will thing, because we've just discovered, using an MRI, that there is no free will. And his argument is that since you can detect this neurological event that precedes the conscious decision, there's no free will. The conscious decision was just caused by something you had no control over. But actually, all along, philosophers on all sides of this debate have agreed that the will, which is what we're talking about, whatever it may be, it might not be a conscious thing. It isn't as though we're tied to the notion that your conscious decision has to play the role that he thinks it does, that Lebet thinks it does. So the notion that this somehow settles the free will issue because they've gotten a certain experimental result is really ridiculous, and it shows a lack of understanding of the philosophical question. But philosophers disagree about free will. There are some philosophers who defend even the kind of free will that you and I both reject, that seemingly magical godlike ability to initiate an action that's uncaused. There are philosophers who defend that view. There are philosophers who, as I mentioned early on in the discussion, will critique determinism for reasons unrelated to free will. So all of these issues are open, and there's no one view that philosophy as a field presents. But I do think that scientists like Levet, before they make these grand pronouncements about having solved an old philosophical question through one experiment, should actually study some philosophy.
James, I think that we have accomplished our goal, because I think we have in the audience and the group of students a lot of different perspectives and philosophies, and we've helped them now encounter two others, and then that will only enrich in whatever their histories lead them into believing.
Well, I hope so. I hope you've enjoyed this. And I think the main thing that has come out of the discussion is that while there's a very serious philosophical issue that arises in learning theory about whether we have free will, it's complicated by compatibilism. Compatibilism is the option here that's often overlooked. There is the sense that free will and determinism represent this exclusive choice, and which one is right? It seems that we have to choose one or the other, and yet it seems that we can't. Compatibilism comes along and says, hey, loosen up, relax, it's no problem. There's actually no conflict if you understand free will right, or, in my view, if you construct a good successor concept for free will, in my case, autonomous control, then you find that this concept that we need to help us understand ourselves and decide questions about punishment and reward and so on, is actually compatible with determinism. So compatibilism as a general philosophical approach is the main thing here, I think, in the conversation we've had.
Well, and I thank you for sharing your voice in the consideration of this important world-changing topic.
Thank you very much. I don't know how much it'll change the world, but it can change the way you think about the world and the way you think about yourself. Thanks very much, Dave, and thank you.